So this is lookup and reference functions round 2. We're going to begin with the match function that returns the item number in a lookup array that matches the item that you're looking for. The index function will return the value at the intersection of a particular row and column within a range. The offset function enables you to reference a cell or a range that's offset from a point of origin, a given number of columns and rows. The transpose function enables you to reorient data either from a vertical to a horizontal orientation or vice versa. And the GETPIVOTDATA function enables you to reference a data point that's contained within a pivot table. So the match function. The match function can be useful when you're using it in conjunction with other functions. But what the match function does is look for a value in a lookup array and return the item number when it finds a match. And a match can be defined in one of 3 ways. So I'm going to set up a match function in cell E24 equal MAT, tabbing that into the cell. The value I'm going to look up is 450, comma, the lookup array is the array right above in the same column. And then the match type, there are 3 options. I'm going to first select exact match by referencing the value that's in cell D24. And now I need to make some of these references relative and absolute and mixed. I want to press F4 3 times to make the match type reference a mixed reference where column D is absolute. Selecting the lookup value, I'm going to make the row absolute, and I can do that by pressing F4 twice. And then for the lookup array, again I want to make the row absolute by pressing F4 twice, then going over to the next end of the range, F4 twice, and entering. And of course, I get an NA return because I'm trying to find an exact match for 450 and it doesn't exist. If the value I'm looking to match is 400, I do get a return from the match function. 400 is in the 4th position on that list of values that's in the lookup array. Copying this match function over and pressing F2 to make sure all of our references are accurate, and they are, I again get the not available error message because 450 is not in the lookup array in column F. So you can look for an exact match, and I'm going to make this 450 again. And of course I'm going to get an NA. But there are also 2 other choices when you're establishing the value for the match type, the optional argument. Copying this function down, enter. When the optional argument is 1, the match type, and I just press the space bar so we can look at what the description is for these optional arguments. When it's 1, the match function finds the largest value that's less than or equal to the lookup value. So the lookup value is 450. The largest value that's less than 450 is 400. That's in the 4th position, and the match function returns the number 4. In order for this to work, your data has to be in ascending order, because if it's not, the values that are being referenced in column F are in descending order, and the match function returns an NA with a match type of 1. So I'm going to copy this down one more time, and when the match type, again I'm hitting the space bar, is -1, down arrowing twice, the match function finds the smallest value that's greater than or equal to the lookup value. So the smallest value that's greater than is 500, and that's in the 6th position. And in order for this version of the match function to work, your data has to be in descending order. Escaping out of that. So this version found the 6th position, and the other version found the 4th position. So summing this up, if you're trying to find the largest value that's smaller than the lookup value, your data has to be in ascending order. So you put the smaller values first. That is a match type of 1. If instead your match type is -1, the match function is looking for the smallest value that's greater than the lookup value. So you have to sort the data in descending order and present the larger values first. The index function. The index function is another one of those very useful functions. And when you combine this with the match function, you can build some really dynamic formulas and functions. So what I want to do is find a way to pull out the value from this range of values that's in cell H14, or the value 90. That value is found at the intersection of the content that's in column H with the content that's in row 14. So I'm going to begin by setting up basically a one-dimensional index function. In cell B13, equal IN, that's enough, tabbing that into the cell. The array that I want to look to is this column of data, because the other argument that the index function needs is the row number, and it needs the row number of the array that I just defined. So the row number 1 in that array has the letter B, 2 has 15, and 3 is what I'm after, has 90. Enter, and the index function returns 90. Now I called it a one-dimensional index because it's only looking in a particular column to give me, in this case, the third item that's in that column. But we can also use the index function to cross-reference columns and rows and have it return the item that's the intersection of those columns and rows. So I'm going to escape out of that and down arrow twice and input another index function. This time the array is going to be the entire range of data, comma, and the row number, well, we already know what the row number is, it's 3. And the column number, we can just count over, beginning in column F, then to G, then to H. It's also 3. Entering, again, we get 90. So the nice thing about the index function is that you can, instead of hard-coding those references for the column and the row, which in this case for us was a value of 3 in both cases, you can use a match function to define those columns and rows dynamically. But before I do that, I want to set up a label that says column and row. And since I'm going to use a match function, I know for the column reference, I want to match the value B, and for the row reference, I want to match the value 2. And I'm going to center align those just to get them to line up a little bit better. And now I can use an index function, and instead of hard-coding the references, make them dynamic by using the match function to look for the correct row number and the correct column number. Equal IND, tab that into the cell. The array is the data, comma, and the next argument that I need to establish a value for is the row number. Well, like I said, I want to use the match function, MAT, tab, to look for this value, comma, in this array, because I want the match function to return the number 3. And it will when it finds 2 as a match in the list of content that I've just selected as the lookup array, because it's in the third position. Close parentheses for that match function, comma, and now I need to define the column number. And I'm going to use the match function once again, tab, to look for the value B, comma, in this array. And once again, it'll find it in the third position, and the match function will return the number 3, close parentheses, close again, enter, and the index function returns a value of 90 once again. So if instead I have the match function look for the letter C, it's going to find that in the fourth column, control enter, and it's going to provide me with a value of 78. And if I change the row reference to look for the header 3, it's going to return a value of 83, because that is the cell that's the intersection of the new column reference, which is the column that has the header of the letter C, and the new row reference, which has the header of the number 3. So the offset function. The offset function enables you to reference a cell or a range of cells that have a geographical location in relation to a beginning point of origin, which is called the reference in terms of the arguments for the offset. So I'm going to build an offset function down here in cell C30 equal OFF tab, and the reference point, or the point of origin, or the reference, as the argument is officially called, is going to be cell C12, comma, and the rows, which is the number of rows I'm going to offset, is going to be in cell E25, comma, and the columns to offset are going to be in cell E26. And if your offset reference is a cell, you don't need to fill in these optional arguments. But if it's a range of cells, you need a height, which is going to be in E27, and a width in E28. Control Enter, and of course I get an error message because none of those arguments have been defined other than a reference. So if I want to have the offset function that's in cell C30 return the value that's in cell C12, currently there is no value in C12, I don't want to offset it at all. I want to offset 0 rows, 0 columns, and I want the referenced range, even if it's going to be one cell, to be 1 cell high and 1 cell wide. So that now when I go up there and put a value there, the offset function refers to that value. I can instead offset by 1 row, which is going to return a value of 0, of course, because now I'm down in cell C13, and offset it by 1 column, so we're going to move 1 column over to the right, which is a column D, and it returns a value of 1, which is the value in cell D13. If I offset by 2 columns, I still have a value of 1, but I should be in cell E13 at this point. And since there's a value in cell E14 as well as E13, I can change the reference from a height of 1 and a width of 1, which is a reference to 1 cell, to a reference to a range with a height of 2 and a width of 1. And I get an error message in the offset function because now I'm referencing a range, and to reference that range without doing anything to it, like summing the values in the range, isn't going to work. So I'm going to put a sum function in here, sum, left paren, end arrow, right paren, enter. And now I get the sum of that range, which are these 2 cells right here. So we began in the reference, we went down 1 row, we went over 2 columns, we have a height of 2 and a width of 1, and summing the range that's referenced in the offset function returns a value of 2. So doing this one more time, I'm going to offset by 2 rows and 5 columns, and I'm going to get a height of 5 and a width of 3, and the result that I get is 14. So where is that area? I begin in cell C12, I'm offsetting by 2 rows, 1, 2, I'm offsetting by 5 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I've got a height of 5, holding the control key down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a width of 3, 2, 3, and the status bar returns a sum of 14, as does the offset function that's embedded within the sum function. So one of the cool things you can do with this offset function is to set up a dynamic print range, which you might have the cause to want to use if you're trying to print a pivot table that resizes as it pulls in more content, more data. So how do we do this? I'm going to utilize a couple of functions that, if you're not familiar with them, there are movies on all of these functions that I'm using. Beginning with the if function, which is a logical function, equal if, tab that into the cell. The test, the logical test, is going to be a reference to cell L13 as to whether that cell does not equal nothing, which I can designate by 2 quotes with nothing in between. So what I'm saying is L13 does not equal nothing. And if that's the case, I want it to give me the row count with the row function, tab, of L13, closing the parentheses, comma, and then the alternative, if L13 actually does equal nothing, I want cell A13 to equal nothing as well. And then close the parentheses, enter, going back, Control C, down 1 arrow, pressing the Shift key, and then the page down. Let's do it 4 times, and entering. I'm almost done. I'm now going to go up in cell A2 and put the max function in there, max, which will return the maximum value in a reference range of values, which I'm going to make cell A12, hold the shift key down, down arrow once, end down arrow, which will take me to the bottom of all of those functions that I just copied in, the if statements, and enter, up arrow a couple of times. So right now the maximum value is 21. Now if I was actually doing this, I would hide column A, because you don't want all this sort of machinations and calculations going on behind the scenes to be seen by people if other people are going to be utilizing your spreadsheets. So the next thing we're going to want to do is set up a print range. I'm going to select this range right here, and it really doesn't matter what range we set up. What we just want to do is create a print range by going to the Page Layout tab in the Page Setup group and then left-clicking the Print Area drop-down. I now want to take a look at that print range, which I can do by going to the Formulas tab and then left-clicking Name Manager. And the Name Manager lists for us the range names, of which we only have one, which is the print area that we just set up. The print area, like any name range, is actually a formula. And it looks like it's the offset function. It's really not. It says offset because the worksheet that is the active worksheet, the worksheet we're working on, is called offset. But we're going to put an offset function in there. So I'm going to left click into that field and backspace and get rid of everything but the equal offset. And then put a left parentheses in there and begin to build my dynamic print range by clicking on the reference for the offset function, which is cell B1. It came in as an absolute reference. That's fine. That's what I want. Comma. I don't want to offset any rows, so that'll be 0, comma, or any columns. So that will also be 0, comma. So thus far we've established that the offset function is going to determine a range by beginning in cell B1, which is the upper left-hand corner of the print range that we're trying to build. The height is the element that we are determining dynamically with the value that's in A2, currently 21. So I'm going to left-click on that. And again, that came in as an absolute reference, which is great. That's what I want. Comma. And the width, currently the width of the content is 11 columns. Let's say that that's what we want, and that's not going to change. We, of course, could make that dynamic as well. But we're going to hard code 11, shift right parentheses, and then left-click the check button, enter, left-click OK to accept the change, and then close. And so back to the print preview, Control P, we have the print job that's only one page, escape, but when I put content, and I'm going to hold the shift key down and page down twice, into column L, Control Enter, Control Home to look at the value for cell A2, my print job should have dynamically increased the height based on the value that's in cell E2. Control P, we see it did exactly that. I now have 3 pages that goes down to the bottom of the content. It's at the top of the 3rd page. Of course, when you start a new page with any content, it's not necessarily going to fill the entire page. Escaping to go back into the spreadsheet. So you can use the offset function to build a dynamic print range. And of course, I would hide all of this if other people are going to use your worksheet. So that sort of happens behind the scenes. The transpose function. The transpose function is actually an array function, which means the references are not a single cell. It's actually a range of cells. So you may already know that if you want to transpose the content that's in column E and make all of that content show up in one row, that you can use paste special Control C, left-clicking a cell that will become the left portion of the transposed content, right-clicking to get paste special, and then left-clicking transpose and accepting that as what I want. The thing about this is it's not dynamic. We just hard-coded the values in row 9 from column G to L. If you want the values to be dynamic, you can use the transpose function. So to do that, I'm going to first define what is the size of the content that we are going to transpose. And selecting that and holding down the left mouse button, in the name box I see that it's 6 rows by 1 column. So I know I need to transpose this into a range that's 1 row by 6 columns. So I'm going to select and hold the left mouse button and drag over till I see the name box tell me that I have a range that's 1 row by 6 columns. Now I'm going to input the transpose function, equal TRA, and that's enough. Tabbing that into the cell, selecting the array, which is the content that I want to transpose, and here's where we deviate from the standard function. Because this is an array function, in order for it to calculate, and in order for it to be set up properly, instead of entering, you press Control, Shift, and Enter, all at the same time. And when I do that, I create an array function. An array function, as I said, deals with range references, regions of cells rather than individual cells. And in the formula bar, you can see this transpose function looks completely different from any other function you may have seen before. There's curly brackets on either side of the transpose function. We never put those in there. What we did is press Control, Shift, Enter. Excel put those in there. If you type them in there, this won't work. You can't type those curly brackets in. You have to tell Excel that you are building an array function by pressing Control, Shift, Enter, and Excel will put those curly brackets in. So instead of hard-coding the reorientation of the content, we've made the reorientation dynamic using the transpose function. And you can actually transpose more than just one column of content. I'm going to transpose this whole region, which is 6 rows by 2 columns. So I need 2 columns by 6 rows, equal transpose, tabbing that into the cell, selecting this region that has the content, pressing Control, Shift, Enter, and I've transposed 2 columns of information into 2 rows of information. The GETPIVOTDATA function. The GETPIVOTDATA function was invented because before, when you refer to a cell in a pivot table, when you rewrote the pivot table, you would still be referring to the same cell, and it may not contain the content that you were originally after. So the GETPIVOTDATA actually defines the column and the field and the pivot table that you're trying to retrieve from the pivot table. So if it moves around within the pivot table, you'll still get the same value. So the first thing I need to do is to create a pivot table. And I can do that by going to the Insert tab, left-clicking Pivot Table, where I first want to select the data, which is right there. And I don't want to create the pivot table in a new worksheet. I want to create it in the existing worksheet, and I'll just pick a location right there. So just to quickly create a simple pivot table, I'm going to grab the product field and make it the row label, and then grab each one of the months and pull them down to the value field, since that's where our values are. So clicking off of that, when I refer to this pivot table, and all I got to do that is to say equal, select a cell that contains data, and you see automatically Excel is going to use the GETPIVOTDATA function, Control Enter. And when I F2 like this, you notice that it isn't referring to that cell directly. It's referring to the data field, which is sum of January, and then it's referring to the upper left-hand corner of the pivot table, which is in cell O11, and then it's referring to the product field, item B. So with those 4 points of reference, the column that I want to retrieve the data from, the pivot table that that column is in, and then the field that I want to reference to return the value for a given item in that field, the GETPIVOTDATA has defined the elements that make it a dynamic reference to pull out a value from a pivot table. And if you ever decide that you don't want to use the GETPIVOTDATA function, you can turn it off by left-clicking the pivot table, going to the Options tab, left-clicking Options in the pivot table group, and then clear this checkbox, Generate GETPIVOTDATA. And it won't change the function we already created, but when we reference the pivot table again, we just get our usual cell reference. So those are more lookup and reference functions. We started by looking at the match function, which enables you to look up a value in a lookup array and return a match of one of three types. We then look at the index function, which allows you to pull out from a series of columns and rows some content in a cell that is found at the intersection of a defined column and row. We then took a look at the offset function, which enables you to define a reference relative to another point of origin that's either a cell or a range. And we use the offset function to build a dynamic print range. The transpose function is an array function which enables us to reorient data from horizontal to vertical or vice versa and to maintain the link to the original data. And the GETPIVOTDATA function enables us to reference some data in a pivot table where when that pivot table is refreshed or rewritten, we don't lose the reference for that data point in the pivot table.